What is good, YouTube? We got a video for the dog Jaded. You know what I'm saying? This is the guy who is popularly known for, forgive me if you're known for, other things as well. But I know of him, and I think most people know of him because he explained infinity via, I believe, calculus terms. He explained it down to the math. We're going to upload from the dog Jaded. He normally does longer form videos, which is why we can't react to him as much. But he made one that fits our timeline. You know what I'm saying? So I was going to pre-follow like. Turn that bell on. And in this case, you know what I'm saying? I find the content. We watch it together. Make sure you hit that bell, Discord comments link down in the description below. Show like this if you're on PC. And in there, you know what I'm saying? You join the Discord community. You'll be notified every time I go live, every time I post a video like this. This is filmed in front of a live studio audience on YouTube and Twitch. Make sure you tap in. Without further ado, though, let's get straight into it.
Nobody could ever break through
Infinity, Every Way to Bypass, episode 3.
Nobody could ever break through
multiple
Gojo's
parts.
infinity. Using the limitless curse technique and the 6 eyes, you're gonna awaken a godly defense that not even the strongest could ever slice down. Except it's actually not true, and infinity has been bypassed, and it's happened more times than Megami has ever won a serious fight. Gojo lost about 4 encounters, and all of them showed that infinity...
That's not fair though. Potential man will never win a fight, because then like the hype of his potential decreases if he wins, because he starts realizing some of his potential, and then he gets a cap. So the reason Megami always loses is because the stocks will always be low. So when you do buy, eventually you'll be able to sell, and those stocks will be high as hell. That's potential, man,
can be bypassed, and I've made an entire video about every time Infinity didn't actually protect Satoru Gojo, and even attacks outside of JJK, which would completely obliterate this technique. Unless you're reading on TikTok, attacks outside of JJK, which would completely obliterate.
Because we've seen, like, I'm telling you,
this technique. Unless you're reading on TikTok. Everybody knows that Gojo isn't completely untouchable, not even in his own series. There's over 50 curse techniques within Jujutsu Kaisen, but most of them don't even encounter Gojo's infinity. But that brings on a good question, because what if they did? Could Gojo's infinity actually stop every attack within Jujutsu Kaisen? That is a pretty good question that a pretty handsome man probably came up with. But you should at least subscribe, because 99% of you guys are not subscribed. But again, don't feel like you have to, right? If you enjoy the video, leave a like, and that's perfectly okay with me. You obviously can't start this video without first explaining what is infinity. Infinity is pretty often considered to be the neutral part of the limitless curse technique, but not only is that not very informative, there is much more than just that. During an event called the Deep Learning Mathematical Lecture in 2021, which is essentially just a bunch of guys with glasses that Gege Akutami put together to better help people understand Gojo's curse technique, there were actual professors and researchers from places like the Institute of Statistical Mathematics or the Institute of Physical and Chemical Research. They all took part and tried to explain infinity to the best of their abilities. Despite the story,
and that's why I remember Jaded. I think he literally went, it was either him or it was Ty. He literally went and explained it down to a T, and like they were talking about what principles scientifically like correlate.
Obviously being totally fictional, Akutami clearly makes an attempt to make his story, I'll say, reasonably practical. Mr. Takano, who's actually a Jujutsu Kaisen editor, holds a master's degree in information engineering with his expertise being in geometry. This technique is very complicated, and because of that, I'm only going to explain the parts that matter for this video. Infinity is the engine, but you can imagine this curse technique having 2 different motors being red and blue, but our focus is still going to be on the neutral limitless, which is actually still infinity if you remember from earlier. Gojo's technique in the most simplest form is just spatial manipulation and specifically dividing, adding, and subtracting space. Infinity is considered the division of space and operates within a barrier around Gojo that prevents any and all contact.
It's like the turtle explanation.
According to the official.
It's also very common in math. My teacher actually talked about that the other day, where like someone made the argument that to get somewhere, it's a bunch of half steps, which means technically speaking, there's an infinite amount of steps you have to take to get there, because as you get there, the distance is cut in half. So to get, there, you have to take a bunch of other half steps. And as the distance gets smaller, those half steps become smaller and smaller. Now, obviously, on a literal plane, we can't do this because we're much bigger than like the atoms and stuff. So to us, it is a small distance we're encompassing. But in theory, there's an infinite distance that we're covering there if we were to only take half steps.
Character guide. It's also possible that you can win about $100 in Amazon, Steam, or Crunchyroll gift cards.
You thought it was gonna fall for the sponsor, Twizzo? Good attempt though, Twin.
infinity being active unless you have something like the 6 eyes, which is also the key to why this technique is even possible.
So
These eyes
dangerous,
grant
yeah.
Gojo an extreme form of cursed energy manipulation, and it's all the way down.
That's what about Gojo though. I think it's like, I don't know which one of his abilities it is, but one of them, like the 6 eyes, gives him like crazy cursed energy control to where like he only uses it basically makes the amount of energy a technique requires smaller on like a really small scale, but he also has a huge amount of cursed energy reserves. So those two things combined gives him almost an infinite storage of cursed energy. And I think that's so cool, especially when you compare it to someone like Yuta, who is able to, spoiler warning, use some of his abilities just because he has such a huge pool of reserves. While for someone like Gojo, he's able to do it because he has a big pool of reserves, but mainly because he has the ability to like shrink that amount of cursed energy he's using with his techniques.
To the atomic level, and in theory, the atomic level is the farthest point that we're aware that Gojo can manipulate space and cursed energy. I've put together a little example to explain to you how infinity works using this arrow and this little dummy of Gojo. Once the arrow ends up making contact with this barrier, which is actually the thing that's housing the infinity, it's gonna experience the infinite division of space, but again, without context or majoring in mathematics, that's just gonna sound like Chinese. Within this barrier is Gojo constantly
And it's a simple mathematic thing. If you don't understand it, go to your calculator right now and take 1 and divide it by 2, and just keep dividing it by 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 and 2. You'll never get to 0. Now, if your calculator is not, if it doesn't go out to a certain amount of decimals, you'll eventually get to 0. But that is the simplification of it. If you were to keep all decimals in there, if you divide something by 2 over and over and over again, you'll never get to 0. It's impossible, because as you make this thing smaller, dividing it by 2, it's going to just become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, while 0 is the absence of anything at all. It is it goes down to like the conservation of energy almost. If you bring it to a realistic standpoint, matter cannot be created or destroyed necessarily. It's all just a transfer of something. Nothing is just spontaneously there. It's something happening, some reaction, some bonding, something to generate, not even generate, but to transfer a type of energy to another type. So in this case, it's just dividing something by 2. If you just have done basic calculus, it's not the hardest thing to understand, because it's like, say you have a limit, you can understand this with algebra too. If you know a asymptote is on a graph, it's something the graph approaches whenever it touches. If you go out to infinity, and let's say the asymptote is at 3, the graph will be at some number that is like 2.9999999. It'll never touch 3. That is how infinity works. But in this case, it's not like the 0 is Gojo. No. What it's doing is it's kind of, this area of space constantly divides how far the object can travel. Because of that, the amount of space here is, ironically, infinite. Hyperbolically, it's infinite. Because this space is infinite, and that in turn, the reciprocal, makes this thing's movement become smaller and smaller, because the space needs to travel becomes bigger and bigger. It appears as if that thing stops. And that's why Gojo's ability is in a force field, where things like clank off, they literally come and then it looks like they're frozen. It's because they're just moving that slow.
Dividing the space between himself and the object traveling by exactly half of the distance. This doesn't seem that problematic at face value, because I'm just going to shoot more arrows at Gojo, and my original arrow is just going to keep crossing the new half of the distance, and then apparently another half, and then another half.
Exactly. But because of that, it's always going to be moving smaller and smaller. So at some point, to the naked eye, it just becomes negligible how small this distance is, to the point where it just appears that it stops. It'll never reach.
Again?
2,000-ish years later.
Still not 0.
Another half, there's another half, and another. I don't know. It just looks like it completely stopped. This would go on and eventually become an infinite sequence where you're always going to have to cross half of the distance, and you're also going to be slowed down by infinity, but that's a totally separate mechanism. Infinity has also been infamously compared to Zeno's paradox, using the race between Achilles and the tortoise, where Achilles will never end up reaching the tortoise despite being much faster than a tortoise, because the distance between Achilles and the tortoise is constantly being divided by half of what it was before to an infinite degree, just like infinity. There is much more to infinity already than I'm going to explain in this video, especially within Jujutsu Kaisen, but the only thing that you need to understand is one very simple thing. Nobody is going to be running through infinity like Wally West or Alien X, or using some type of existence erasure like a Kai from Dragon Ball. Anybody within Jujutsu Kaisen is well aware that you're either going to need to bypass, shut down, or just slash through Gojo's infinity.
Really? I didn't know this.
Like Wally West or Alien X, or using some type of existence erasure like a... Nobody is going to be running through infinity like...
I didn't know that. I genuinely thought speed lets you get through infinity, but obviously to the like comical proportions where like Wally West, if you're using like base forms of him, he's just really fast, but he's outran concepts like death, time, etc., which by default is putting his speed at like essentially boundless, which means even though this thing is dividing it by 2, it's like in basic calculus when you're dealing with infinity over infinity. If you have 3 infinities divided by 2 infinities, the limit is 3 over 2. Because even though both of these things are infinite, because one is still bigger by like, you know what I'm saying, 1 infinity, while the other is smaller by 1 infinity, when you compare the ratio between the two, it's a real number of 3 halves. Even though these things are huge and unquantifiable in our brain, the understanding that there are multiple present then makes that math possible, if that makes sense. So I assume those with like infinite speed would be able to bypass it because it's like putting infinity over infinity, you just get 1. Translating that to, you know what I'm saying, actual practical effects, I'm infinitely fast, you make things infinitely slow, I'm at a normal speed, but that means your ability doesn't affect me.
Wally West or Alien X, or using some type of existence erasure like a Kai from Dragon Ball. Anybody within Jujutsu Kaisen is well aware that you're either going to need to bypass, shut down, or just slash through Gojo's infinity altogether.
Bro, why'd I have to use the bathroom again? Hold on. Like 42. Yeah, to me that confirms I gotta be sick, bro. That joint just, I'm drinking water, but I can't be drinking that much water. I literally, last video, used the bathroom, bro. Said I might be cooked. Stream, hey, show must go on though. It's gonna be like one of the best streams, and it's right before we get out of school too. Ending it with a bang type tech. All right, I'm here. I'm immersed. Say no to myself. That's where you cut.
Together, which we'll talk about later. There's over 50 curse techniques within the series, and I'm not really interested in talking about why jetpack hair or the ice formation curse technique obviously can't bypass infinity.
Okay, how to get rid of it?
Probably the most obvious example is going to be Angel's Extinguish curse technique. This curse technique is, like I said, pretty simple. You just extinguish or burn out other curse techniques, and it's the same ability that actually set Gojo free from the prison realm and shouldn't have any problems bypassing infinity by just burning it away. Depending on the translation, they sometimes say that she's burning out other curse techniques or that she's extinguishing other curse techniques, but the point is pretty clear. You could argue that Gojo might be able to raise the output of his infinity and therefore be able to somewhat resist the burnout of the curse technique, similar to what Gojo did to Hanami in Shibuya. This does depend on how literally you want to take the burning out or extinguish part of the phrasing of her curse technique, because for example, when taking out a fire, the water that you throw on a flame could potentially be boiled and the fire could still be growing and even rising. The terminology of extinguish is different than the terminology for domain amplification, which specifically uses the word neutralize, because the idea of something neutralizing another thing,
it makes it ineffective, while extinguish with a fire extinguisher is just something capable of reducing the fire, hoping that it disappears. While neutralize literally just means like, oh no, that thing there, it doesn't affect this. You know what I'm saying?
Does depend on output by definition, which extinguish doesn't really in a lot of contexts, so you can take it as you will. Sky manipulation is more debatable, but can very arguably bypass infinity, and specifically will only really work using Thin Icebreaker. Oro's regular sky manipulation probably can't bypass infinity, which would end up pulling on it rather than passing through, and you really need to break through the barrier, which is exactly why Thin Icebreaker is the perfect technique. The attack is actually never aimed at the person, but rather the surface of the sky. Oro isn't even really trying to aim at her opponents necessarily. I mean, she kind of is, but not really.
So the thought process is, as it's not targeting him, because infinity, the way it works, the way it was explained in the flashback, is that his brain kind of automatically determines what's a threat or not, and that's why he can still touch things he wants to touch. So arguably, if she's not aiming at him, I think that's the point he's trying to make here. Because if not, it's still having the space. I just have to be an infinity type ability where like, oh, it covers infinite distance. It has to be explicitly stated, something like that.
She's just cracking open a thin layer of sky, which would contain her opponent and effectively trap them. Theoretically, Oro or Yuta using Thin Icebreaker should be able to bypass Gojo's infinity, assuming that the barrier containing the infinity would be trapped within the layer of sky, which is then cracked open by the Thin Icebreaker. Yuta said that this
then couldn't he just break through? Like, if he's in a barrier and you encase the barrier with another material, I can still move because I can move within my barrier. Would that not give him the ability to just break the barrier? You get what I'm saying?
This attack passed right over his defenses and blew him into the air, which makes sense because Oro was never aiming to overpower Yuta's block, just the area of sky that he's currently within, which in theory should also be able to bypass infinity. I'm saying theoretically because this might be impossible if there isn't any sky for Oro to crack open with any type of physical contact.
Yeah, because technically the area, all of the area around him is distorted. I can't watch this. I'll be lurking till the vid's over. Hey, shout out to you, bruh. Hey, did you peep you got a sub? I gifted you a sub, gang. It's no more ads for you, gang. You know what I'm saying?
This is mostly because infinity being wrapped around Gojo within that barrier is constantly touching Gojo, or if they aren't touching, then they're just too incredibly close for Oro to crack open.
You deserve that,
Miguel,
bro.
who was probably informed by Geto, claimed that Gojo can control cursed energy on an atomic level, making it virtually impossible for any sky to be contained between Gojo or the infinity for Oro to then crack open. Maharaga also ended up bypassing Gojo's infinity, but without using any crazy type of technique, and instead, he just changed the essence of his cursed energy. The approach here sounds pretty simple, but not even Sukuna, who has god-tier cursed energy efficiency, could replicate the effect that Maharaga had on his own blade, which is exactly why he kept waiting for the world-cutting slash, but I'll focus on that a little bit later. Maharaga can adapt to any and all phenomenon that doesn't immediately one-shot him. Maharaga's adaptation relies on receiving information to analyze and then find a proper counter to the attack or the entire technique in general. Maharaga receiving another identical attack during that period is just going to make the adaptation accelerate, and not only that, but Maharaga will continue to analyze the attack even further even after it's already developed an adaptation to a previous attack. Maharaga can keep on adapting to the same technique over and over.
Basically, you can see a lot of the math, like him talking about how the editor has a degree in geometry. You can see a lot of the math present here, because by default, Maharaga in essence is just the exponential function. You know, out to a certain number, it may be smaller than any other function, but if you go out to infinity, it is way bigger than any other function. No matter how absurd of a function you want to come up with, because exponential growth is the fastest type of growth. And that is essentially what Maharaga is. And then that makes him not only just mathematically, but theoretically the perfect hard counter to someone like Gojo, who's dealing with infinity. While, as we know, over an infinite amount of time, an exponential function only becomes a greater and greater force. It's unstoppable force versus immovable object. essentially.
And over again, and he's basically never going to stop coming up with adaptions, and there might be a limit, but we have never seen it before. I've said
Right.
adaption like 6 times, but you get the idea. Obviously, after reading Gojo vs. Sukuna, you know that Mahoraga creates 2 different methods for bypassing infinity, and probably could have created more with enough time and information. This is more of a side thing and really shouldn't be taken super seriously, but Toji's inverted Spear of Heaven also bypassed infinity and had its own foreign type of cursed energy. Maybe Mahoraga changing the essence of his cursed energy created something similar, making infinity nullified by some other form of cursed energy that's different than the normal, but this is just mostly my theory. Overall, adaption could definitely bypass infinity. It already has twice, and it would continue to find new creative ways around this technique with enough time and information. Sukuna's curse technique, Shrine, has also actually bypassed infinity during the end of his fight with Satoru Gojo. There is no official name for this, but I'm going to be calling it the World Slash, and the reason why there is no official name is because the World Slash is just a big dismantle. Infinity is always going to be active, and it's always going to create the infinite sequence and infinite division that's going to stop any ordinary slash attack like a dismantle to ever make its way through Gojo before ultimately being slowed down and stopped. However, by Sukuna aiming for the world itself, similar to Oro's Thin Icebreaker not actually aiming for the opponent,
and that's like the Mickey-ness about the ability. Its activation base is a perceived threat.
he ended up bypassing the defense completely for something that was truly unimaginable.
See, but then that makes his technique like not make sense. And the reason it does that is because it makes his technique so OP that you can't use its explanation. The explanation of it is supposed to simplify it, but in this case, the explanation of it is what makes it so darn OP. So we're now dealing with something that like you know what I'm saying? Oh yeah, but there's a loophole. If it's not attacked directly at him, but around him or in that space, then he's cooked. If that's the case, it's deep fried. Because then you can make the intention argument, but they show here that even with peak control, they can't do that. That doesn't mean other people can't do that. And that also implies that, again, if it's like a space annihilation, like if someone goes, oh yeah, I'm going to use Sakai to destroy the entire planet, and this is on the planet, technically speaking, according to these definitions, I'm not attacking him. I'm attacking the space he inhabits. Would he not? You know what I'm saying? According to that argument, that makes his power so much weaker. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments down below.
He aimed for space instead of Satoru Gojo or the Infinity. Cutting down space, which also contained the Infinity, is just another form of cutting the Infinity, because regardless of how strong this technique may seem, Infinity is always going to operate within space, meaning if you just cut space, you'll also in theory be cutting through the Infinity, which is exactly what Sukuna did using the World Slash. There is no debate. The World Slash...
So it's the space in between, so it has to be a spatial attack. So someone like Yami would be able to pierce through it. It has to be a space distorting event rather than... Okay.
Flash is going to completely rip through Infinity 10 out of 10 times by just completely ripping through space, and that's exactly what it was designed to do. Takaba's curse technique, Comedian, would also bypass Infinity, and it's pretty much stated literally in one of the most oriful narrator comments in the entire Jujutsu Kaisen story, and verbatim stated capable of opposing Satoru Gojo. Takaba's curse technique isn't something he's even fully aware of happening, but still operates fine regardless, and that's kind of the whole idea. The Comedian curse technique is going to manifest any joke that Takaba makes that he himself finds funny. Kinjaku says that his attacks were forced into being ineffective and that the comedian had been negating his technique. Even special grade curse spirit,
yeah, it's like common sense wise, I'm not going to find my own self. I'm not going to find you harming me funny.
End up destroyed in one attack when Takaba manifests this truck and completely runs them over, and there's also numerous times where Takaba reimagines the entire fighting ground and turns his opponent into a nurse. Kinjaku said that this technique isn't just creating an entire fighting ground and turns his opponent into a nurse.
Hold on, she kind of...
Kinjaku said that this technique isn't just creating events from Takaba's imagination, even his own mind is being forced into responding, literally creating his own form of soul resonance with Kinjaku, by the way, which is absolutely insane. If Takaba thinks that Gojo's Infinity is just completely hilarious, then
it's like reality
then he can probably walk straight through the infinite space, and to be honest, I would even think that that's funny. There's also the possibility that Takaba's curse technique has already worked on Gojo before when he was unsealed from the prison realm, but this is a little bit more theory-based, and I'll get into it anyways. Angel's curse technique was used to unseal Gojo from the prison realm, and the entire plan was to unseal Gojo from the back of the prison realm, kinda like an exit. But everyone was surprised, and Gojo obviously never appeared, and then Takaba makes a comment about how another useless piece of trivia is known to the world. If the back of the prison realm is exposed to Angel's curse technique, then Satoru Gojo is wiped from existence. Then Gojo finally appears, but exactly where Kinjaku placed the other side of the prison realm, and not the one placed by Angel and the rest of the group. Maybe Takaba found it funny that another piece of trivia from Angel being being useless was funny and then Gojo actually returned somewhere else after being wiped from existence became even more funny, I'm not really sure where the joke would be, which is kinda why it's a theory, but either way, Takuba's comedian could definitely bypass infinity if it hasn't already in some weird way. Yorozu's curse technique is called construction, but currently in the anime, it's only been used by Mai, the trash can Zenin. Yorozu and Mai can construct virtually anything that they can imagine straight up from scratch, only using cursed energy, and this could be anything from a small bullet to even a special grade curse tool like Maki's replica of Toji's blade. This technique requires an enormous amount of cursed energy, which makes this ability practically useless unless your name is Yorozu.
But if you had the 6 eyes with this ability,
her cursed energy volume and output is on par with some of the strongest in the Heian era, which would also include Sukuna, who himself has twice the amount of cursed energy as Yuta, which also means more than Gojo. Yorozu is actually pretty cracked, but I'm gonna push that agenda a little bit later, so for now, focus on her technique. Using the construction curse technique, Yorozu can create pretty much anything to bypass infinity, which would include the inverted spear of heaven. This was actually an ongoing theory during the fight between Gojo and Sukuna before finding out that Sukuna never actually used the curse tool and it served zero purpose throughout their fight. Yorozu and Mai don't just create objects that are similar to their originals, they're exact replicas from the caster's own imagination, and they even remain active long after the creator is gone.
Which in theory implies that if they could imagine something even crazier, they could create it.
If you were to take this a little bit further, theoretically, construction could create anything with enough cursed energy and imagination. I don't see why Yorozu or Mai with enough cursed energy and imagination couldn't create some type of object from outside of the series to also bypass infinity. This next curse technique is extremely similar to construction and follows the same thought process, and it's Reggie's contractual recreation. This curse technique allows Reggie to summon and recreate anything that he's already purchased by burning them with cursed energy with no real drawbacks like construction. Obviously, you're going to be more limited to what you can bring out against Satoru Gojo because you're just recreating an object instead of just conjuring them up into existence, but that shouldn't really matter. Assuming that Toji can just lend you the receipt for the inverted spear of heaven, then using contractual recreation, you could also bypass infinity. Just like construction, you're technically not limited to just creating things within the series, and without the major cursed energy consumption, you could probably summon an even greater concept that can also bypass infinity. Reggie literally summoned an entire house and then dropped it on Megami. Assuming your curse technique is either construction or contractual recreation, you'll either need the blueprints for the Omnitrix with the download of Alien X or just the receipt from when you bought it on Facebook Marketplace. Judgment is Higuruma's curse technique, which manifests this large Shikigami and then forces his opponents into a non-violent courthouse.
He reminds me, his Shikigami reminds me of that thing from Studio Ghibli. You know what I'm saying? The thing Wimby was for Halloween. But yeah, Alien X is tough. One-on-ones know what my dog Alien X really capable of, bro. Alien X is one of them, bro. If you tapped in with Ben 10, you know, bro. Because Ben 10 has this weird thing with dimensional beings where, like, they have 11th and 12th dimensional beings in the series. And then they also, if I'm not mistaken, admit that the race that Alien X is are outside of that whole thing. So if they're outside of that reality that contains, like, 11 and 12 dimensions, you could argue they're not bound by those things. And if these 11th and 12th dimensional beings, like the smoothie creatures, they appeared as smoothies because they appear as whatever you like most. Ben likes the smoothies, they appeared as smoothies. That's a reality altering ability. Whoever sees you as their most treasured thing, and you don't even have to know what it is. It affects them without you even intentionally doing it. And then you have a being outside of that is able to control all things time and space on a whim if the three minds can come into agreement. You feel me? But Alien X, full control, no restriction, he got that, bro.
House within his domain.
Because also arguing the whole thing about Gojo's thing with space, wouldn't that not argue that anyone who can manipulate time can kind of quit his ability? Because if the whole Sukuna, this is spoilers of Doom, but if the whole Sukuna tech is, or even with the other girl, the ice ability, they were like, oh, it doesn't target you, it targets the space around you. His ability operates in space. Space, to my understanding, is a lesser dimension than time. The reason I say that is us as humans, we cannot traverse time as we please. We can traverse space as we please. So that implies if you can control time, you know what I'm saying? You would technically be able to halt the space within that time or control how that space operates. For example, if his ability, as it was explained, is just dividing that thing the closer it gets, you'd be able to manipulate the time that this thing is affecting him. So for example, say you started off with the number 50, the thing's going 50 miles per hour. Now it's going 25 miles per hour at this point in space. If you rewind the time on this object, it's now going 50 again. So you divide it by 2, it's now going 25 again. You just repeat that process, it will never go under that 25 miles per hour. So instead of stopping like it normally would, by essentially jumping on the number line wherever you please by manipulating time, the way the ability manifests in space is then altered. You know what I'm saying? That was my crash course. You know what I'm saying? I hope I explained that well enough. But Gojo's joint is explained via calculus. Think of a limit, think of an asymptote on a graph. You know what I'm saying? You go out to infinity, you'll never touch 3. But the whole argument here is if we're assuming what's on the graph is like some type of speed, not position. If your speed in the beginning was a slope of 1, but as you go, that slope decreases, by manipulating time, you can ensure no matter where you are in space, you're using that slope that you once had. That's like the argument.
The non-violence policy within this domain is actually pretty strict, and even if Infinity
I fought with the intellectual conversations, chat, I'm saying.
wasn't already shut down based on its qualifications for preventing violent actions, Gojo's Infinity would definitely be shut down after the trial. Higuruma's technique isn't just emulating Law and Order, it's the entire idea behind putting his opponents into a hearing where they're forced into pleading with the judgment. Satoru Gojo is definitely going to be walking out there guilty. This guy is going to be so guilty. This guy is going to be guilty as hell. You could argue that killing Hanami and Jogo isn't illegal because they're not human, and honestly it probably wouldn't even be viewed in any particular matter within the Japanese legal system, but that's not even close to the worst offenses that Gojo has committed. Destroying millions of Japanese infrastructure, threatening political officials, and even incited an
the way he beat that nigga Miguel, bro, that was racism.
An actual homeless guy with a hollow purple along with those same political officials later on in the story. Gojo literally crippled hundreds of people in Shibuya and effectively made them into vegetables using his domain expansion Infinite Void. Gojo would certainly receive the death penalty and receive confiscation, which would mean that his curse technique would be taken away by the judgment and Infinity would obviously become virtually non-existent. Unless Gojo's going to be holding some type of curse tool, or maybe Sukuna's finger, which again is kind of iffy. Judgment isn't exactly going to break through the Infinity. He's just going to neutralize the Limitless altogether and then pretty much get rid of Infinity. Here's where I'm going to put an honorable mention, despite not actually being considered a curse technique, but it is the Black Flash. Cursed energy flashes black when it's applied within 1/millionth of 1 second, and it's basically JJK's own version of a critical hit. This perfect synchronized millionth of 1 second.
But this right here, distortion in space. Basically, so the argument he made earlier, if you weren't here to hear it or you forgot, that really baffled me, is he made the claim that characters like Wally West, who have by a long shot proven that they have more than infinite speed, cannot bypass this infinite amount of space. That is interesting to me, because if this space is infinite and it's dividing by 2 infinitely, and something is moving an infinite amount, if you've done any amount of calculus, infinity over infinity would be 1. You know, 3 infinities over 2 infinities is 3 halves. It becomes a real number. So the point I'm making here is if these are 2 infinities, this ability essentially gets nullified. However, Wally would move at, like, say, a normal person's speed, he would still be able to bypass it. But he said that's not how that works, because it specifically divides the space. Now, this Wally has moved faster than a teleporter. So if a teleporter could teleport exactly to him, he's not moving. It's an instant hit. By definition, is teleportation not the manipulation of space? So it's like, I would argue Wally would be able to bypass it. But in the event that it doesn't, his whole claim is the only way to bypass it is with space. And this data panel alone states that it happens and distorts space. Knowing that, if you were in theory to hit one at Gojo, it would distort that space for this small amount of time. I don't know how you're going to be able to make an impact with this little amount of time, but that's why you put it in like honorable mention. But we have previously just articulated why time is a qualifier to essentially getting rid of this ability as well, because time affects space.
Second, and it's basically JJK's own version of a critical hit. This perfect synchronization multiplies the strike's impact by the power of 2.5, which is much bigger than it would seem, but it also causes the user's cursed energy to flash black and, more importantly, distort space. Some people have argued that black flashing would bypass Gojo's Infinity, but in reality, this would definitely never happen. You could argue that because the black flash requires physical contact,
it's just the amount of time. Even without that argument, assuming you could just pop it, it only exists for that 0.0000001 seconds. So in that time where this infinity is like not even nullified but distorted, you still have to get through like the rest of the distance it would take for that fist to connect, and the ability is back in full effect. And no matter how small of an infinity you have, it is still infinity. So you'll never cross that distance.
You could never actually make that contact on infinity, and you couldn't ever land a black flash on an infinite division of space. But even if black flashing does create some type of distortion in space, there's no real way to measure if this distortion in space is large enough to distort the space that's containing the infinity and the barrier that's surrounding Gojo. Overall, here's the short answer, and it's that, for one, you have to assume that black flashing on something like infinity or landing a black flash that comes in contact with infinity is even possible. The second thing is that there's a lot of issues with black flashes being uncontrollable, but we'll assume that 1 and 2 aren't even really a problem. You still run into the issue with the fact that the distortion of the black flash might not even be large enough to fully break through the infinity, knowing that Gojo can just change the size of the barrier like he did with Hanami. There's other scenarios like some soul-based attacks, or maybe even Yuta or Kenjaku using their curse techniques to body swap or copy other curse techniques that could also bypass infinity, which could be argued as other methods for bypassing infinity as well. But that's all going to be something I'm going to have to save.
I was about to say, this Jade is one of them, bro. Some people don't have like the outro in their John, so like you just get teleported to the next video. Shout out Jaded for another intellectual breakdown, basically, of can infinity really stop JJK? A breakdown of infinity, very intellectual conversation. If you enjoyed the way I broke some stuff down, the way he broke some stuff down, comment down below why you think it would work, why you think it might not. And yeah, without further ado, just stay healthy, happy, and hydrated, and I'll catch you in the next. Peace.